Are you ready? Now you have to commit to this because it's going to rain today. So are you ready to march to the White House this afternoon on this 5th anniversary of the war and tell President Bush and his backers it's time to invest in America, not endless war in Iraq? Are you going to march? Are you going to march, Rick? Rick, you're going to march. Good morning. Again, my name is Brad Woodhouse. I'm president for Americans United for Change, and I'm honored and actually humbled to be moderating this panel on the Bush legacy and the specter of a second Bush term. I want to thank Roger Hickey and Bob Borsage for putting this important topic on the agenda, and I want to thank them for doing so much work on the conservative legacy and the failure of conservatism in America. I'm honored to be joined on this panel today by such an array of accomplished people, accomplished progressives and professionals in the progressive movement. Jared Bernstein of the Economic Policy Institute, John Podesta, CEO and President of the Center for American Progress, and Arianna Huffington of the Huffington Post, and all other things cool. I want to particularly thank John because he's pinch hitting for a panelist who had to drop out, and I must say by way of introduction that much of the work that Americans United is doing on the Bush legacy and the project that I'll show to you here in a minute in my PowerPoint presentation, it's really John is the intellectual founder of that work, and he's been talking for a long time about the importance of focusing on President Bush, focusing on the conservative legacy. And this discussion of this dark era of American history is vital to progressives. Don't anyone think that we can just say bye-bye George Bush. That I hear people say this all the time, well, Bush is history, people have moved on from George Bush. If they do, we're going to be, we have the potential to be in a lot of trouble. Because if we do not define this era of history, the demagogues, the ideologues, the fearmongers, the warmongers, the supply-siders, and the global warming deniers will be back in power doing it all over again. If we do not take this opportunity to tie the failed ideas and ideology of conservatism as embodied by George Bush to conservative candidates, including John McCain, we risk losing the transformational change in American politics, which literally is within our grasp today. Now, I'd like to take a quick minute because I really want to get on to these panelists. You don't know even who I am. You know all of these great folks who have been involved in the progressive movement. But I want to briefly move on to a Bush Legacy Project, and then I'll introduce our presenters in turn. And we have a PowerPoint presentation on this. Americans United for Change, along with the Progressive Media Center, is embarking on the Bush Legacy Project, which is really what this panel is about today. And it is about redefining the political debate and driving a stake in the heart of conservatism. Next slide. Now, from 1933 to roughly the mid-1970s, progressives were on the offensive. However, from the mid-70s until recently, really until this last election, progressives have been on the defensive. Next slide. And in 2008, the last year of Bush's presidency presents us a real opportunity to redefine the political debate, move the center in our direction, and mortally wound conservative ideology. Now, some may ask, next slide please, why is this opportunity different? We've been trying to do this for years. Well, I think as John will attest, President Bush is enjoying, perhaps the wrong term, historically low approval ratings. We've never seen, I mean, there was an ARG poll recently that had the president's approval rating at 19%. We've never seen a president with such low approval ratings. Conservatives are in a funk regarding McCain. They don't know what to think of him, whether or not to trust him. We've seen a lot of unrest in conservative think tanks and institutions. There's really been a fraying of the Republican coalition. I think we saw that in the Republican primary. And there's even this, it boggles my mind, there's been a re-examination of what it means to be a conservative. There's even polls to show that 10% of conservatives consider themselves pro-government. Go figure. So an interesting change there. Next slide, please. And there are several lessons, though, that we can take from the Reagan legacy, which should be instructive of why each and every one of us cannot take our eye off President Bush and his legacy and the conservative legacy. One, in 1987, during Iran-Contra, Reagan's job approval rating fell to 40%. It was 57% by Election Day in 1988 when his vice president succeeded him, and it was 63% when he left office. This allowed conservatives to define his entire presidency as an example of successful conservative governance. Next slide. And we have lived with the consequences of the Reagan rebound ever since. We lived with it through the papering over of trickle-down economics and disastrous budget and labor policies. One consequence of the Reagan rebound was Newt Gingrich, Tom DeLay, and the Republican Congress, which literally put progressives on the defensive throughout the 1990s, even while we held the White House. Next slide. And probably worst of all, the Reagan rebound gave us, in their mind, legitimacy for George Bush's era of trickle-down economics, budget deficits, the degrading of government institutions, and neoconservative foreign policy, which we have seen for the past 8 years. Next slide. I mean, one should ask, what would the world look like today if President Reagan had ended his presidency with a job approval rating in the low to mid-40s as opposed to the mid-60s? Inquiring minds would like to know. Instead, next slide, please. Remember these headlines. Reaganism makes a great theme for election. This is in 1994 during the Republican Revolution. Reaganism resurfaces among GOP. I'm Reagan's true heir, says Bush. McCain invokes Reagan. Next slide. So the goal of the Bush Legacy Project, which Americans United is leading but is working on with a number of other groups, including the Center for American Progress, and other organizations which are involved in developing the materials and the actions. One is no Reagan rebound for Bush. We want to keep Bush's approval ratings low by reminding Americans why they have lost faith in his agenda, highlight how Bush's conservative economic, social, and foreign policy agenda has failed, and shift the center of the political debate away from the conservative frame to the progressive. And I think perhaps most importantly in the short term, tie President Bush and the conservative agenda to the Republican brand and its followers, including John McCain, Mitch McConnell, John Sununu, Norm Coleman, and all of the people who stand in the way of change in America. Next slide, please. Now, there are a number of implications for not mounting a campaign. Number one, we saw this the minute we announced this effort. Conservative candidates and conservative blogs said, oh, you know, Bush is not a conservative, or you know, but the failures of Bush were not a result of the failures of conservatism. They were the result of, you know, poor management, incompetence, bad people, bad personnel, and we can't let them get away with that. The failures of the past 8 years are a direct result of a conservative ideology which does not serve America. And if we don't mount a campaign to define this era, we'll miss an opportunity literally to define the differences between us and them. Next slide. So we have a number of elements of the campaign that we've begun, and we've really got out of the gate around the State of the Union address with paid advertising, which we'll hope to continue throughout the course of the year. We have been putting on events around the country, both as President Bush has moved around the country and as Senator McCain has moved around the country. We also have a coordinated rapid response activity across groups and issues. We're not trying to, by any means, do it all. We work with a whole host of coalition partners in defining President Bush and reacting in real time to what he and his administration are doing on a daily basis. Next slide. Other elements, online activity. We released an online video yesterday about the cost of war in preparation for the 5th anniversary today. Issue forums like this will be a key component of this project. We held one of these at the Press Club earlier this year. Traditional concepts like bus ads and billboards and concerts. But the centerpiece, and I want to tell you the most exciting part of the Bush Legacy Project, in my opinion, is the Bush Legacy Bus. We're constructing a bus. I mean, it's going to be tricked out, plasma screens, the whole 9 yards. And it's going to visit 200 sites in battleground states, House, Senate, and presidential between late May and the election. And it's going to define the Bush legacy for what it is. Next slide. Oh, there you go. That's the wrap on the outside. So this will be rolling into your community sometime over the next 6 or 8 months. Next slide, please. So the implementation of the Bush Legacy Project, we're conducting with our partners regular Bush rapid response calls, and we have email listservs. We're constantly monitoring President Bush and what the conservative cabal is up to. We have groups that are taking the lead on certain issues. We have been involved along with groups like the Center for American Progress, Campaign for America's Future, and U.S. Action and others in message development. We've conducted focus groups, for example, around how swing voters respond to President Bush. And we're doing policy research, looking at the state of America when President Bush took office and today. We also have calendared activity. For example, we have the event that we all are working on today to recognize the 5th anniversary of the war and the development of collateral material. Next slide, please. And the gauntlet has been thrown. Now you may laugh at this, but this has serious implications. The president's supporters have said that they want to get his job approval rating by the time he leaves office to 45%. Now that doesn't sound like, such a great accomplishment, but I can tell you this, and I think John and the others will attest, if President Bush were to get that type of rebound, it would have tremendous negative effects for us in this upcoming election. At 45%, President Bush can raise more money, he can campaign in more swing districts, and he can be a factor in this election, a more positive factor in this election than if we can keep him at his current at the current state. So they've thrown the gauntlet down. Next slide, please. And we have accepted the challenge. Next slide.
We will be judged not only by what we say or how we say it. We will be judged by what we're able to accomplish. First, we must be good stewards of this economy. America must become more energy independent. We're in this fight to win, and we are winning. The state of our union has never been stronger. Never been stronger. Never been stronger.
Did you like that? Thank you very much. That ad is an ad that we have been running, that we did run around the State of the Union address. So that is the Bush Legacy Project, and that is to some extent the challenge at hand. Now it is my pleasure to get into the rest of our panel that will look more deeply into President Bush's legacy with some particular emphasis on the economy and Iraq. First up, it is my pleasure to introduce Jared Bernstein, who is a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute. He is the author of the new book, Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed, and Other Unsolved Economic Mysteries. His last book was Altogether Now, Common Sense for a Fair Economy, and he's also the co-author of 8 editions of the book, State of Working America. He has published extensively in popular and academic venues and is a frequent contributor to the cable station CNBC. He holds a PhD in social welfare from Columbia University. Please give it up for a great economist, Jared Bernstein.
You don't, thanks for the nice intro. You don't hear that, please give it up for the great economist often enough. That's something I'd like to hear a lot more of. Thank you very much, Brad, for the great presentation, nice introduction. Thank you to Roger Hickey for inviting me here, my friend and research colleague James Lynn for helping to provide this PowerPoint, which I'd appreciate if you could load my PowerPoint. And it's great to be here with John and Ariana as well. I'm here to talk about the Bush Economic Legacy, which is an opera in 3 acts in 10 minutes. And in these 10 minutes, I'd like to take you through 3 dimensions of the Bush economic legacy. This is an opera that's in a minor key. You could even call it a tragic opera. But while, as you'll see, the Bush economic legacy is grim, its failure is glaringly obvious. We have an electorate that ranks the economy very high above all else in terms of its importance to them as they think about this next election. We have a Republican candidate who explicitly embraces Bushonomics and wants to push it even further. So, as Brad was pointing out, there's an opening for a very different approach. Next slide, please. This just defines the legacy and has Bush saying, honey, I shrunk the economy. Next slide. Now, these are the 3 tiers of the economic legacy that I'd like to take you through. The first is the condition, the economic conditions that we're left with. The second, which gets down in the weeds but is critically important and underappreciated. I suspect this part of the presentation will be some things you probably haven't heard before. And finally, the ideological nature of the legacy we're left with, the nature of the current policy debate. Next slide. I'd like to take you through some pictures of the economic conditions, the first tier of the Bush legacy. Some of these pictures absolutely belong on the Bush legacy bus, by the way. If we could get them on the outside or somehow, you know, flashing on the bus as it drives by, that would be pretty cool for people who like that kind of thing. You know, Bush et al. Talk a lot about all the jobs added over their recovery, and he's not alone in that. Every president does that, but in this case, he's got particularly little to brag about. If you look at the historical rate of job growth over every business cycle, that is, if you take a business cycle from its peak, you know, from one peak to another peak, over the course of the full cycle where the economy is expanding, typically employment grows by 14%. But in this case, it grew by about 4%, less than a third of the typical rate of job growth. This has had a profound effect on the job market. There's actually been historically weak job creation under President Bush, and it's one of the reasons why we have, next slide, a really profound inequality problem. Here's one of the slides I'd like to see on the bus. This is the share of income accruing to the top 1%. And what's nice about these data provided by a couple of academics named Piketty and Sayes is that it takes you all the way from 1913, this is a very historical stuff, up to 2006, the most recent data, preliminary. And what you see there are 2 real mountain peaks in terms of the extent of income concentration at the top of the scale. Back in the late 1920s, 24% of income was concentrated at the top. The top 1% held 24% of all income. Now we're at 23%. We're absolutely within striking distance of this ignoble historical record. And the important thing to recognize in terms of the Bush legacy, this hasn't just been a Republican story. This has happened over Democratic administrations as well. But the important thing to recognize is that the last time we had such a peak back in the 20s there was also a period of what I call yo-yo economics. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's an acronym for you're on your own. It's yo-yo economics, it's laissez-faire economics, it's corporate excesses that prevailed in the late throughout the 1920s, and well, that ended badly, I think we can say, from an economic perspective. And now we've seen many of those same type of excesses. It's the direct outcome of this yo-yo economic approach to policy. Just to give you a feel of the next slide, of the numbers we're talking about here, just the incredible gap in incomes. If you look at the average income in the economy, average household income, you're looking at $54,000. That sounds about right. Probably nothing surprising there. But if you start going up the scale, and you look at the group that's, right there at the very top between the 95th and 99th percentile, so, really pretty far up, well-off people, you're talking about income ranges in the 210,000. But if you go to the very top sliver of those folks who occupy really the Promethean heights of the income scale, now we're talking about $30 million a year. So that just gives you a sense of the disparities we're dealing with here. Now, how do disparities like this, next slide please, come to pass? Obviously, for most workers, for most of the folks that we at the Economic Policy Institute think of when we're practicing economics, the big story is the paycheck, not the stock portfolio. Now, clearly that's different if you're talking about that top sliver, but most people, for all this nonsense about, the Opportunity Society and we're all shareholders now, it's really a paycheck story for most families. And the fact is that real wages have been flat for many workers, and particularly important, have been flat over the 2000s, the period of the Bush legacy. What you see there are trends in wages for low, middle, and high-waged workers. And with the exception of a relatively short period in the latter 1990s, when people like John Podesta were in charge and we had a different economy ongoing, with the exception of a relatively short period, middle and low-wage workers saw their earnings quite flat, such that by the end of the period, they were just about where they were over a generation prior to that in the early 1970s. Little progress has been made, especially if you sort of just take out that little upward slope that prevails in the latter 1990s. And the 2000s are particularly notable. Next slide, please. Let's take a closer look at that from the perspective of family income, median family income by race and ethnicity. You have 3 lines here. Each one of them tracks the income of the family right in the middle of the income scale, the median family. Think of this as the middle class or the typical family's income. And without getting too deeply into the numbers, the amazing thing here, this is another graph for the bus, I think. The amazing thing here is that in each case, the middle income family has yet to recover the losses that they have incurred over this supposedly great economic boom of the 2000s. Typically, family income declines in a recession. That's not at all surprising, and in fact, it's probably something we're going to be looking at in coming months and years, given the current recession. Family income declines in a recession, but it bounces back when the economy picks up. That didn't happen this time. And as you can see, this has the dotted line at the end is a forecast that takes you to 2007. 2008 looks like a recession year. So we are now facing the most, I would say, the biggest indictment of the Bush economic legacy is that this is the first economic recovery in the history of the data going back to the 1940s where the middle income family never recovered their prior peak. Through all the productivity growth and the alleged job growth, which you saw was quite weak, very much associated with this graph, this productivity-rich recovery obviously did not reach middle-income families who are actually going to end this recovery just about back where they started. Actually, skip the next slide in the interest of time, and actually skip this one too, just because I want to get to the other speakers. I want to move on to part 2. This will go more quickly. Click the arrow button once. So I want to talk to you a little bit about another dimension of the Bush legacy, one that I think is less appreciated, and one that's very near and dear to my heart as someone who's been in this town for a while, and but also someone who, as I suspect many of you, share a sense that actually government regulation is an important part of improving the quality of life for lots of families out there. And if you defund and abuse and ignore and basically try to dissemble the functions of government agencies, you end up hurting a lot of people. There are, click through this just 2 more times and then stop there. There are 4 separate markets wherein government deregulation has gone much too far. In labor markets, we've had a Department of Labor that opposed a minimum wage increase for years until they couldn't resist it anymore. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, has refused to intervene in clear-cut cases where workers' safety has been abused. Our National Labor Relations Board is absolutely not supporting the right of workers to organize. In fact, they've removed millions of workers from protection of labor law, including nurses, teachers' assistants, leased employees, disabled workers. The wage and hour is failing to enforce overtime, and misclassification of workers is rampant. Financial markets, well, don't get me started on those. I mean, what's amazing is the way these guys start to believe in government when their game starts to fall apart. Can't even get it out. What's amazing is we can argue about the necessity of bailing these banks out, but what's most important right now, some of the work of Josh Bivens at EPI makes this quite clear. What's important right now is that we start talking quid pro quo to these banks and to the financial sector. If we're going to bail them out, they're going to have to sign up to some regulations that are just glaringly obvious and that they simply can't ignore at the expense of this bubble economy that we've been dealing with. And that includes capital requirements and more transparency, perhaps even some equity shares. I'm going to skip the next two in the interest of time, but I can say more about them in Q&A if you like. Finally, there's the ideological legacy. Now, the current, if I wanted to give you the yo-yo economic recipe, the Bush legacy yo-yo recipe for running economy, it kind of goes like this: bubble, recession, recovery, repeat. That's pretty much what we're looking at. I'm sorry, go back to the previous slide. Yeah, that one. So the question, though, is how much of this is really part of the Bush legacy versus the tendency of markets to overshoot and derail? You know, presidents take a lot of credit when the economy goes well, and they hopefully get whacked when it goes badly. But you know, you can ask yourself a good question: how much of this really is Bush legacy, and how much of this is just what an economy does if left to its own devices? And it's that left to its own devices that is so important. The answer to that question is that it absolutely ties into the legacy. It's pure yo-yo economics. This notion that an unregulated market economy goes off the rails, overshoots, and engages in the kind of excesses that you see manifested in the inequality graph and in the current recession, this is not an unknown problem. It's been well known since the Great Depression. And unregulated markets derail. This is, Bush and company are big purveyors of this, but they're not alone. And the beauty part for us is that not only is getting rid of yo-yo economics a good idea because because yo-yo economics is unfair and leads to the kind of income gaps we've seen, it's also inefficient and it's also destructive to economic growth. So you can be a good old-fashioned neoclassical economist and embrace these ideas that we're espousing, that Democratic candidates are espousing. These ideas both reconnect economic growth to living standards, and they get you out of this destructive recipe of Bush-onomics. If you just click through the last slide, I'll finish up. Okay. Okay. So here, talk about recipes. I go through this in my new book, Crunch, which just came out, and takes you through these arguments and ideas in more detail. But I think here are the 4 or 5 steps that it's going to take to clean up this legacy. And it ain't going to be easy. This is a mess that is pretty deeply embedded in our system. Step 1 is to restore faith in government. That's not easy, but the demand is there. The demand is absolutely there among the electorate. Step 2 is to elect wits and not yo-yos. Wits are we're in this togethers, and the yo-yos are you're on your owns. Step 2 is to get your fiscal house in order. Now, this doesn't mean balancing budgets. We can absolutely sustain budget deficits of a small or medium magnitude. I'm not talking about balanced budgets. I am talking about the absolute need to raise the revenues we need to meet human needs and the obligations of good government, to return competency and reverse this regulatory legacy that I think is so destructive. Now, step 3 is to tackle the big challenges. And I hear the candidates talking about this. It's not about tinkering. Reversing the Bush legacy is not about targeted tax credits. Reversing the Bush legacy, as we articulated the EPI Agenda for Shared Prosperity, is about major reforms, including health care and environment. Step 4. Now, step 4, repeat steps 1 through 3 until economic empowerment is achieved and prosperity is broadly shared. So that's our economic recipe, and if you work with us, work with me, work with EPI, work with these folks, that's the recipe that we can cook up for the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. I've never had such a thrilling talk on the economy. That was quite, and it was. And in all seriousness, it was quite instructive about the Bush legacy, and we see these chickens coming home to roost, so to speak, and in the current economy. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is, again, as I said earlier, is pinch hitting, gracious to pinch hit for another panelist who dropped out. John Podesta is president and CEO of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. John served, as you all know, as chief of staff to President Clinton from 1998 until 2001. He also served as both assistant to the president and deputy chief of staff from 1997 to 1998. From January 1993 to 1995, he was assistant to the president, staff secretary, and a senior policy advisor. And John is currently a visiting professor of law on the faculty of the Georgetown University Law Center. Give it up for John Podesta.
Thanks, Brad. And I guess I have to thank Jared. I hadn't seen that slide before, but that spike in low-wage income and working people's income in the last couple of years, I'm going to call that the Podesta era from now on. So thank you. Look, Brad asked me to come and join this Bush legacy panel, and normally you think of legacy, that's kind of like a good sounding word. What's the president's legacy? I think this really was intended to be Bush's disastrous stewardship of our country panel, and I don't know why he thought I'd have something to say about that, but I'm honored by the fact that he thought I might have a little bit to add. You know, I begin this discussion by thinking back to a piece that Sean Wilentz, the famous Princeton historian, wrote 2 years ago in Rolling Stone, which was entitled "The Worst President in History." And with 2 years to go, Sean tried to actually judge whether George W. Bush had been the worst president in history. And I think I want to make sure that everybody's awake this morning, so maybe I'll give you a little quiz. I mean, he judged it based on historical factors. And I think, let's put it to a test of the competition. One of the people that he thought maybe was in contention was James Buchanan, who laid the groundwork for the dissolution of the Union and the Civil War. Anybody want to give him a vote for the worst president in history? Let's see a show of hands. I can see you. Well, there's one. How about Warren G. Harding? He not only presided over the most scandalous, probably, presidency in history, and the most corrupt presidency in history, which was actually not only just cooked up by his administration, but right in the White House, presided over Teapot Dome. Any historic buffs out there? Oh, I at least got a couple of votes for that. How about Nixon? There got to be a few votes for Nixon. Oh, well, okay, just a few, just a half a vote. Okay, how about George W. Bush? Worst president in history? Got it. You know, I don't think that's really just an expression of partisanship. I'm sure our friends from the O'Reilly factor, who I saw here earlier, will accuse us of that. I think that it's not, you know, sometimes I think that people, particularly on the left, people in the progressive community like to sort of think, or maybe sometimes think, that the president really just doesn't get it. He's not all that sharp upstairs, and, you know, he's done the best that he can under the circumstances. But as a friend of mine once said to me, there's a big difference between being stupid and not knowing anything. And I think when you think about George Bush's presidency, and you think about the big decisions that a president really needs to make, I think that, as Jared really began, and I think Ariana will finish up on, George W. Bush has simply gotten all the big stuff wrong. And I think that was really not just an expression of not knowing anything, although I think that the president takes, I think, great pride in not knowing too much. But I think it really is an expression of ideology, and why what Brad's doing is so important, and why this our discussion here this morning is so important. On national security, I'm not going to go into it in depth because Ariana's going to talk about it, but the Iraq quagmire has clearly eviscerated the readiness of the greatest military machine in the world. Our ground force is overstretched, overdeployed, soon to be understaffed. But that wasn't just a failure of execution, I think, as Brad noted. The real failure was in the conservative vision cooked up at the American Enterprise Institute in 1998 by Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith, who has his own version of his mea culpa out in bookstores as we speak. This was a failure of vision. It was a flawed premise that American military power could lead the charge for democracy in the Middle East. And it wasn't the only example of national security failure. I think if you go back to the earliest days of his administration, the rejection of the International Criminal Court, the breaking his campaign pledge to reduce CO2 emissions from power plants, his disdain for Kyoto and climate change, pulling out of the ABM treaty, arguing that the Geneva Conventions were quaint and obsolete, as members of administration have done. I think this has been, again, an idea and an attitude that emanates from ideology and has led the country in a disastrous direction and created the circumstance under which American power is at a real low point around the world, and certainly American moral leadership is at a low point around the world. And when you think about the opportunity cost that we had, when you think about where the world was, where it was ready to be, when it was ready to be led, particularly after 9/11, it's really breathtaking. On the economy, Jared's already really gone through that. I just add a couple of statistics. Median household incomes are nearly $1,000 lower than in 2001. That's probably the most important expression of how administration or presidency is doing. He's already mentioned income inequality, but now we've got inflation going up, household incomes being stretched, the dollar's going down, and more inflation on the way. Oil hit, I think it was yesterday, it was $108 a barrel. A week earlier, it was $110 a barrel. I think when you think about the energy crisis, and particularly the climate crisis, which is, in my view, the most important issue facing not just the United States, but the globe. Again, what did we get? We got denial that climate change is real. We got an energy policy developed in secret at an undisclosed location, a broken campaign promise, as I mentioned, to reduce CO2 emissions, the gagging of climate scientists, protection of tax breaks for oil companies who are making record profits, and veto threats against a bill just recently to extend tax credits to companies investing in renewable energy. You can go down the list on health care. The number of uninsured has skyrocketed again. The share of the population with employer-provided health insurance has dropped from 64 to 59%. 9 million children are uninsured. What do we get from the president? Vetoing of the expansion of the children's health insurance program. So because it may be the case that a few of those kids who would have gotten health insurance under a very popular and very productive program might have had private health insurance, and you certainly wouldn't want to do anything to interfere with the profits of those health insurance companies. On family values, they like to claim family values. I think nowhere is there a better example of the hypocrisy and overreaching than the conservative attempt to interfere in the end-of-life decision of Terry Schiavo and her family. The conservative movement, you know, sometimes like life goes by so fast you forget what happened just a year or two ago. But the conservative movement, led by Tom DeLay, the paragon of virtue, and then in the House, I guess I would stop and note that just as a point of good news that Democrats actually won Mr. DeLay's seat and now Mr. Hastert's seat, the architects of the conservative Congress. But obviously he led the fight to insert the federal government into the personal decision of a family and doctors dealing with a very, very difficult choice about end of life. I think there's nothing is a better example of as I said, the doctrinaire lines that they would take and the politicization of important moral questions. I'm about out of time, but let me give Bush grudging credit for one score. He told us that government was the problem. And I think he's done his goddamn level best to produce a government that is the problem. The most corrupt, ignorant, awful federal government the nation's ever experienced. And I don't think that was an accident. It was really the project, it was Karl Rove's project, really, to turn the federal government not into an expression and tool for the common good, but one of partisan domination, one of crony capitalism, one that took care of their friends and kept themselves in power. I think it's at this point kind of come a cropper, so we'll see what happens in the next election. But why does all this matter? Well, I think Brad said it at the beginning, and let me just close with this. I was around. I worked in the Senate at the end of the Reagan administration. I saw the, and you at least give Reagan credit. He actually established a relationship with Gorbachev that led to some arms control agreements. But he was down and nearly out, and they created a project, and we let them create a project to lead this country once again into a conservative direction. The Bush Legacy Project goes on as we speak. There's a $500 billion, $500 million project going on at SMU to restore the Bush presidency. I think that they will do what they can to pass the baton on to Senator McCain, who has now embraced both his war policy and his economic policy, to try to pretend that George W. Bush was just misunderstood. The public numbers that you saw up there are simply an expression of a guy doing his best and doing the right thing. They now compare Harry Truman wasn't enough. They now compare themselves, if you look at what Tony Snow says, what Alberto Gonzales says, and what the president himself says, to Abraham Lincoln. You know, job approval going down at the end of his presidency before his assassination because of the war, but doing the right thing for America. Well, I don't think George W. Bush is Abraham Lincoln. I think he's Herbert Hoover, and it's our job to really remind the American people of that every day. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And, you know, John's been on this for I know, at least a year, talking about how important it is to keep President Bush in the discussion and the conservative ideology that he represents. And that presentation is absolutely breathtaking about his legacy. Now it's my honor to introduce Arianna Huffington, who is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post. As you all know, a nationally syndicated columnist and author. She's had at least 11 books and one coming out that I'm sure she'll talk about. Her last was on becoming fearless in love, work, and life. Originally from Greece, she moved to England when she was 16, graduated from Cambridge with a master's degree in economics. At 21, she became president of the famed debating society, the Cambridge Union. She is co-host of Left, Right, and Center, Public Radio's popular political roundtable program, and a frequent guest on television shows from Charlie Rose to Bill Maher to Larry King to Hardball to The Situation Room and Keith Olbermann's Countdown. In 2006, she was named to the Time 100, Time Magazine's list of the world's 100 most influential people. Huffington lives in Los Angeles with her 2 daughters. She's not only influential, she's charming. Give it up for Arianna Huffington.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and I'm going to follow John's advice about a show of hands. So I'm going to start by asking you to raise your hand if you have not had sex with Eliot Spitzer, Jim McGreevey, Dina McGreevey, Don Patterson, or Mrs. Patterson. And these are all good Democrats, progressive Democrats. I'm sure Larry Craig somewhere is tapping his foot and wondering why he was the one being thought of as kinky. We have come together year after year and lamented the takeover of the right by the lunatic fringe. Well, for me, that was absolutely proven beyond any doubt during the Republican debate when the moderator asked the Republican candidates to raise their hand if they did not believe in evolution. And 3 of them raised their hand. At that point, I thought they should have been escorted from the stage and told to go read their science books and return the next 4 years, after 4 years, to run for president. Instead, I kind of fully expected the moderator to ask as the next question for the Republican candidates to raise their hand if they did not believe in gravity. And maybe 5 of them would have raised their hands. So this is basically the state of the right. And I have spent the last year writing a book which is called Right is Wrong, and which is basically asking the question, how did we allow this dysfunctional right to take over the country, to take over our democracy, to take over our constitution over the last over 7 years? How did that happen? And the answer to that question is incredibly important, not just because we want to look back at the Bush legacy, but because we want to course correct as fast as possible and avoid something like that from happening again. So these are my 3 answers to this question. The first one is the role of the media. I don't believe that the right would have gotten where it got without the enabling by the nation's media. And there are 3 ways in which the media have enabled and continue to enable what the right is doing. The first is that the media tend to look at everything as though it has 2 sides. Every story for the media has 2 sides. So you have the moderator who comes forward as a supposedly completely objective, neutral observer, and presents Al Gore on the one hand to tell us about the dangers of global warming, and Senator James Inhofe on the other hand to tell us that global warming is a fraud. And these 2 positions are supposed to have equal value. Well, they don't. And you know what? Not every story, not every issue has 2 sides. We are no longer debating slavery. We are no longer debating whether the earth is flat. We should no longer be debating global warming. We should no longer be debating whether unregulated free markets work. The jury is in. We should no longer be debating whether the war in Iraq is a success, for heaven's sake. And yet the media, again and again, present what's happening in Iraq as a mixed bag, quote unquote, right? To describe what is happening in Iraq as a mixed bag is a little bit like going to the doctor and getting a diagnosis that says, you know, there's good news and bad news. The good news is your acne has really cleared. Your bad news is you have a brain tumor. Now, I do not consider this a mixed bag diagnosis. In the same way, I don't consider what's happening in Iraq a mixed bag, and yet there was John King on CNN the other night following John McCain in Baghdad. Remember, John McCain could not even go to the market where he had gone before, supposedly to have a safe stroll, except we found out that he was accompanied by helicopters and 100 guards, and he couldn't even go there this time because it was in the hands of a militia. But nevertheless, it was a mixed bag, according to CNN and many others. It doesn't matter how many benchmarks are not met, how many Iraqis are displaced, over 4 million right now, how many soldiers die, how many casualties we have. The media will continue to present Iraq as a mixed bag, and we need to keep correcting them. Because otherwise, we are going to be in the position we are now, which is that many American people, far too many American people, believe this surge is working. Please say all together now, the surge is not working. The only way in which the surge is working is as a phrase. The surge is working as a phrase. But the surge is not working in any other way at all. And yet, John McCain keeps telling us it is working, and he keeps telling us that he wants to do more of the same. You know what? This should disqualify him from being able to hold sharp scissors, let alone be President of the United States. The other major fallacy of the media is continuing to look at everything in American politics through the obsolete lens of left versus right. You know, I think this debate is over. What used to be left-wing positions, universal health care, corporate responsibility, bringing the troops home, are now mainstream positions. And it's very important for us to keep talking not about right versus left, but right versus wrong. Because the positions of the right are not at odds with our positions here at this conference. They are at odds with the American people. They are at odds with reality, they are at odds with facts, and they are at odds with the truth. And that's what we need to be focusing on. But the media keep looking at every issue and saying, do you remember during the Libby times, for example, when Libby was pardoned, right? And immediately, I monitored every show, and it was the left is outraged. Why was it the left? It wasn't the left that was outraged. Vast majority of the American people that believe in equal justice were outraged. But by saying the left is outraged, the left wants universal health care, the left wants to bring the troops home, it marginalizes the position. So we need to guard against that. At the Huffington Post, we have a moratorium on using the terms right versus left. Only because if we continue using them, then the implication is that the truth, the right solution, is somewhere in the middle. And the truth is that very often the truth is squarely on one side or the other, and not by splitting the difference. The final thing to say about the media is that the media are suffering from attention deficit disorder, which is why that their coverage of Iraq over the last 7 months has dropped by 80%, which is why you now have just over 20% of the American people who can tell you that we're about to reach the 4,000 benchmark in terms of how many American soldiers have died in Iraq, not to mention over 30,000 casualties, not to mention what's happening to the vets' families, what's happening to the American army. And that is something that is incredibly important to keep stressing. You know, as a Greek, I've studied, you know, Athenian history and what happened to the Athenian Empire. And the Athenian Empire basically collapsed after the completely unnecessary and wrong invasion of Sicily. The Athenian army was lost in the quarries of Sicily. And I'm afraid that if we don't bring our troops home, the American army will be destroyed in the deserts of Iraq. Very quickly, my two other points, my two other reasons why we allowed the right to hijack our democracy. The second reason has to do with the fact that Democrats continue to allow Republicans to own national security. And that has to be changed. I really want to issue an incredible warning that despite the fact that the American economy is in such crisis, Democrats need to own national security before November. They cannot allow Bush and the right to continue acting as though they're the ones who will keep us safe, because they're not. They're the ones who have made this country much less safe, and we need to say that again and again and again, because they would not be where they are now if they had not been able to use the fear card. Fear-mongering is what had made it possible for them to prevail, and the fear card is what John McCain is going to be using all the way between now and November. And remember, in the end, because the lizard brain is activated when fear is brought to the forefront, we need to remember again and again that that's when the logical brain takes basically second place, and the lizard brain makes the decision. So we need to address the lizard brain and convince the lizard brain of the American public that it's Democrats who actually can keep them safe. And the final point I want to make, the final reason why we are where we are, is the fact that Democrats have not unequivocally and relentlessly stood up to the Republicans. You know, we have been cowed at many, many corners. And now it's time to actually have zero tolerance for certain ways of arguing. First of all, we cannot allow John McCain to ever say again that Al-Qaeda is going to increase the levels of violence because it doesn't want John McCain to be president. That should be outside the realm of political debate in this country. We allowed it to happen in 2004, and we paid a heavy price. We allowed Orrin Hatch to go out there and say Al-Qaeda wants John Kerry to win. We allowed Dennis Hastert to go out and say all that. And at least when it comes to the United States Congress, we need to say it is completely un-American to politicize real threats to this country for the sake of getting elected. There is nothing we can do about Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, Ann Coulter, Michael Savage, and all the rest of them. They are toxic curiosities. But there has to be a different standard to what happens in the United States Congress, and it is up to us to demand censure and to demand an absolute zero tolerance for statements like that, starting with John McCain's statement. So let me just end by saying that over the past year, it seemed that America was really poised to turn a new page and close the book on this tragic chapter of our history. However, the nomination of John McCain changes that. McCain is the Trojan horse. I'm sorry, another reference to Greek history. He is the Trojan horse the right desperately needed to put a faux maverick, faux independent, faux straight-talker imprint on the same ruinous policies that have taken us down this dark road. So though the era of the right has exhausted its historic course, collapsing in moral, political, and economic bankruptcy, the transformation and co-opting of John McCain shows the durability of the right and the Bush legacy, and it shows the lingering danger that it poses. So there is nothing automatic about its disappearance, not unless all of us together give it and John McCain a mighty push into the wings and out the national stage door. Thank you.
Arianna, thank you very much, and I think it is very instructive that Senator McCain, the former, I think, self-described maverick, and I think this is what, if you take nothing away from this, when you think of John McCain, when you think of all of the Republican candidates running in key House and Senate districts, on the war, same as Bush, on health care, same as, go do it with me now, same as Bush, on trickle-down economics, same as Bush. And so this is a vitally important period we have ahead of us. I want to thank very quickly again our panelists. We ran a little long on time, and I know there's a program in between. I know there's a couple of announcements to be made. These panelists will be here though out in the hallway if you have any questions for them. I want to thank again Arianna Huffington. I want to thank Jared Bernstein for that great economic speech. And I want to thank John Podesta. And I want to thank once again what each and every one of you do and what you're going to do every day between now and November to make sure that the Bush legacy is in the past, not in our future. And thank you very much, and thanks Campaign for America's Future.